Okay, good afternoon. Oh god, delay. Good afternoon, year 11, possibly parents, possibly, well, anyone really. And in the best possible way, welcome to my bedroom. So, I've got my phone here in case Mr. Morgan tells me to immediately quit what I'm doing and then sort of that I'm immediately fired. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through paper one. So hi mum and dad, there are now 6 people watching. This is mildly disturbing, and we are going to go through the Tempest first, followed by Jekyll and Hyde. I must apologise for the fact that this is probably one of the most terrifying things I've ever done, because I simply don't really do this. Okay, so we're going to start with the Tempest, and we're going to start by just going through the absolute bare bones of what happens in it. So in terms of context, this is one of Shakespeare's absolutely later plays. In fact, it is his last performed play, we believe, and it was performed during the wedding not the ceremony, the celebration in London of the wedding of Princess Elizabeth, who was the reigning King James I's daughter, and who was pretty much the cause for the Gunpowder Plot. What happened was a lot of English Catholics believed that they wanted Princess Elizabeth on the throne because she was Catholic instead of James I, so they tried to blow up Parliament when James I was in it. This, of course, failed, and one of the repercussions of this was sort of that Princess Elizabeth was married off. She'd become a really interesting person, actually. She was, for a very short time, the Queen of Bohemia, which is now in the sort of Czech Republic, and that would sort of cause she was only queen for a single season. She became the Winter Queen, which is quite interesting. I don't know, I've got a sort of soft spot for Princess Elizabeth. I feel like she had a really hard time, but she did end up being incredibly important to most royal families in Europe. She actually sort of there are very few royal families in Europe through the late 1600s, early 1700s that can't directly trace themselves back. If you're looking, yes, I have blocked live chat. Seeing some of your usernames on YouTube, I've decided that is probably both relevant and advantageous. Ooh, 8 of you now. Look at you all. Well, not look at you. I don't want to look at you. Okay, so it's performed right at the end of Shakespeare's career. He's almost a little bit sad about the end of his career. He also sort of starts to appreciate the fact that his life has only been about the theatre. Shakespeare, obviously hugely influential now, but at the and hugely influential through his life then, but actually not the most important playwright in London for quite a significant amount of time. That's probably Robert Greene, who's Queen Elizabeth, the queen that comes before James I. Robert Greene was Queen Elizabeth's favourite for quite a long time, and part of it was that Shakespeare was always battling against the fact that in terms of class, he was a lower class than a lot of the sort of traditional poets and playwrights in London at the time. He only went to grammar school as opposed to a private school and then a university, a public school and then a university, like Robert Greene did. And a lot of playwrights at that time decided that Shakespeare shouldn't be a playwright. He shouldn't be part of this set of artists that were really, really influential. And so Robert Greene actually, he sort of brings his own joke back on him. He describes in the first really published example of Shakespeare's name turning up, he describes Shakespeare as an upstart crow beautified by our feathers. So he actually launches Shakespeare into the limelight, and then Shakespeare gets his own back after Robert Greene's death by rewriting one of Greene's own stories. Actually, it's not a play. He rewrites Greene's Pandosto into a play called The Winter's Tale, and that's the penultimate one of Shakespeare's published and performed plays. And he actually makes it wildly more successful than Pandosto ever was, and not only that, he also through the course of it takes the mick out of Robert Greene on a regular basis, including his storyline. The central point of that play is that there's this great big gap of time in the middle of it, which Shakespeare sort of really highlights and says, look, this is ridiculous. So Robert Greene, so Shakespeare gets his own back on Robert Greene late in life, sort of as one of his final acts. So the Tempest turns up right at the end of Shakespeare's career. It's his final play, and it's what we refer to as a problem play, in the same way that we refer to Winter's Tale actually as a problem play, in that it doesn't quite fit into an absolute context of his other plays. It's difficult to class it as a genre. It's not a true comedy. It's not a true romance. It's not a true tragedy. We probably refer to it as a comical romance. We try and avoid the term romantic comedy because that sounds like that just sounds like Love Actually, really, doesn't it? Although I guess there's quite a lot of similarities, loads of interlapping storylines, short time frame. Yeah. Anyway, so we have these multiple storylines existing on an island. Now, one of the reasons why we refer to it as a romance, it has a very short time frame. It has an existence of magic in what we refer to as magic realism, something that Shakespeare likes doing, and we see that in Midsummer Night's Dream as well. He likes real magic, so magic where no one questions the fact it's magic. They're just like, hey, it's magic, it's fine, it's cool. They don't question how it's happening. So if you think about something like Harry Potter, what happens in Harry Potter is there's magic, but everyone goes, hey, that's magic, look, it's magic, and they really point out the fact that it's unusual. In these sort of Shakespearean magic realism, what happens is they're magic and no one goes, look, it's magic, why is no one questioning this? They just sort of roll with it and let it happen, which is quite nice, really, and it has this sort of subtle feeling that we're looking at a slightly jilted world. Now, The Tempest is reasonably rare in Shakespeare in that it doesn't have a single source text. We don't have one text that he essentially ripped off to get hold of. So when you think about Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet is totally ripped off an Italian folktale. The Winter's Tale is totally ripped off Pantosto. These are the same narratives, the same storylines, just Shakespeareanized. That's a horrible word that I hope never to use ever again. Whereas this has no real singular source text. Now, a lot of critics suggest that it's absolutely if sorry, I've lost track because Adash has just emailed me. Thank you very much, Adash, for what is essentially bribery. Excellent. Always a pleasure. One of the things with this text, a lot of critics suggest that this is heavily influenced by a piece of text called The True Reportory of a Shipwreck, and this is based on this is actually the true story of a shipwreck just off the outskirts of Bermuda, which was at the time a just being discovered, effectively. We talk about this as the era of colonialization, the first era of colonialization. This is the first time that English citizens, British citizens, as well as citizens of other countries, were trying to expand the world. They were looking for other places to live, and the era of exploration had sort of begun, and one of the things was that European empires especially were trying to find other land, trying to find what was referred to as white gold at the time, which was sugar. It was definitely sugar, and this was sort of this real idea of this impetus of trying to get somewhere, to get land, to get people, and the start of slavery, and also to get hold of sugar and other sort of precious minerals as well, gold from South America, the Spanish and Portuguese especially trying to get hold of gold from South America. Okay, so that's sort of a fairly historical contextual idea of what the play's sort of touching on. To say it's a colonial play is a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't quite make sense, because Shakespeare's writing at the very early time when colonization is happening. So although he raises really interesting questions, particularly with Caliban, about sort of things like who what it means to be human in an era of slavery, and also what it means to sort of exist in someone else's country and take that over. We can't really refer to it as a real post-colonial colonial text because it's not quite there yet. Now this seems a little bit silly really, because we have like the Roman Empire sort of 1600 years before this, who are exporting slaves across the world, and who are like, yeah, I was watching Gladiator last night actually, which is sort of got into my head. You know, so you have slaves moving across the Roman Empire quite commonly actually. So slavery has been in existence for a long time, so at least we can talk about Shakespeare's attitude towards slavery and what it means to be a human, and this is something that we should be aware. He regularly questions what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a human being. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of run through the play, effectively highlighting some quotations that I think are really important, highlighting some areas, and then touch on particularly sort of ideas of greater themes within the play from quotations. Some of them will be a little bit too long, some of them you will know fairly well. I'll make this document, so I've got a document which in front of me which just got selected quotations in, which I've gone through and trawled through. So we'll spend sort of hopefully about 45 minutes doing this, and then we'll take a little break where I'll go and probably cry somewhere for a short time, and then we'll come back and do Jekyll and Hyde after the break. So I think I'll probably just make these available as well, so that you can watch them back, but for the 13 of you that are currently watching this, thank you very much. It's a nice sunny day outside, and we're, well, you might be outside, I don't know, I'm clearly inside. So yeah. Okay, so I want to start with Miranda. So ideas of femininity are really really powerful within Shakespeare, and the idea of what a woman's role is within culture becomes really important. So so Miranda in Act 1 Scene 2, so Act 1 Scene 1 is just the shipwreck, that's all it is really. Act 1 Scene 2 is Miranda and Prospero on the beach, looking at the shipwreck that Miranda has Prospero has commanded Ariel to create. And Miranda asks of Prospero, "You have often begun to tell me what I am, but stopped, and left me to a bootless inquisition, concluding, 'Stay, not yet.'" Now we know that they've been on the island for a significant amount of time, and at no point on the back of this Prospero has ever told Miranda her origin. Now there are two things you can read into this. Firstly, the idea that this is a sort of idea of intellectual colonialism. You control people by the amount of information they know. Miranda has no idea the outside world exists. She is absolutely closeted. She is absolutely kept confined on this island. The only people she knows are her father and Caliban, and we're pretty sure she has no idea that Ariel exists. So she is stuck, and Prospero has consistently kept information from her. Prospero, a lot of people talk about this novel as this play as a play of prisons, that everyone within it is confined in some way. Actually, that's something that comes out in Margaret Atwood's reinterpretation of this play, which is really worth a read. Hagseed. So consider getting hold of that. It's probably in paperback now actually as well. Really, really good. It also helps you sort of understand the plot of the play, and also has some sort of relevance to the 21st century as well. What we get from this is that Miranda, what we get is two things. We get firstly a setup quite early on that we are expecting an idea of a romance. One of the absolute core tropes of a romance, one of the absolute recognisable elements, is that it has what's called a retrospective narrative. So at the start we are told what has happened leading up to this point. Now this play in terms of time is incredibly short. In terms of what we actually see on stage, we do not get broad sweeping storylines that happen over years and years. We get less than a day. but we get less than a day that's a mere snapshot of the final point of a long-running storyline. So the retrospective narrative that Prospero tells Miranda in Act 1-2 is all about the fact that he has sort of kept from her a lot, and we get this huge political power struggle described in a very short amount of time as the setup for the play. And this is one of the elements of a romance. So what we actually have here is effectively this play is only the denouement of a significantly larger storyline. What we're being given is the tiny ending storyline, the tiny bit at the end of a huge story. But Shakespeare only wants us to have that. He just wants the little bit at the end. He wants the gloss, the tiny bit. And so Miranda leads into a retrospective storyline. But one of the things she does is that as part of that retrospective storyline, she states that she's never been told where she's come from. Which is quite interesting when we consider that Prospero is meant to be a really caring character. He's meant to care for his daughter, but, as we see later in the play, he pretty much just sells her off to the highest bidder to ensure his own position in society when he returns to Milan. But also, he's intentionally kept from her the outside world. She is, in a way, no better off than Caliban or Ariel. But Caliban and Ariel seem to have the agency to speak out against their confinement, whereas Miranda doesn't. Miranda's voice is permanently stymied. In fact, she's put to sleep when Ariel appears. Prospero puts Miranda to sleep in order to just keep her quiet. Now, Prospero is a difficult character. He threatens Caliban very early on in Act 1, Scene 2 again. For this, be sure, tonight thou shalt have cramps, side stitches that shall pen thy breath up. Urchins shall for the vast of night, that they may work all exercise on thee. Thou shalt be pinched as thick as honeycomb, each pinch more stinging than bees that made 'em. Now, Prospero's threats are quite interesting because they demonstrate how narrow the Shakespearean view of the outside world was. What's demonstrated to us is that most people in sort of an Elizabethan and Jacobean era had very little idea of what the outside world looked like. So the threats that Shakespeare gives Prospero, later on we're threatened with hedgehogs, a sort of distinctly European animal. The threats there are based on things that would be recognizable to the audience. But also, Prospero is absolutely based in nature. He's utterly based in nature. There is very little idea of civilization. He is the most civilized man in an uncivilized world because he has books. This is the idea of, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Prospero is king because he has a slight advantage. He has his books, those that he says he'll drown at the end of the play. And this is why Caliban is so indentured, so suppressed. And so Caliban is a little bit of a difficult character in that, on one hand, he recognises he's been captured, he recognises that he's being ill-treated, and he recognises that Prospero is cruel to him. But on the other hand, he almost craves a master. We talked about this last year in terms of Stockholm Syndrome, a very modern idea of people who fall in love with their captors. Caliban's isn't a love, but it is a craving. And the question about this is Shakespeare presenting an ironic statement that people crave control, or is Shakespeare presenting a very, what in his mind, a realistic, quite derogatory, very racist statement that all people from foreign countries crave leaders? And so the obvious quotation that I think most of you know already, "This island's mine" by Sycorax, my mother, leads on to the entire speech of him sort of knowing his own island, which thou takes from me, which thou campst first, thou strokest me and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in't, and teach me how to name the bigger light, and how the less that burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place and fertile. Cursed be that I did so. All the charms of sycorax, toads, beetles, bats, light on you. For I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. There's sort of two really important bits you can learn in that, which will pay off in a lot of different questions. This island's mine by Sycorax, my mother. I think you probably all know by now. Thou strokest me and made much of me, wouldst give me water with berries in it. It's quite nice because you can interpret water with berries in it as possibly wine, which is also quite nice. I like and teach me how to name the bigger light. There's the idea of the bigger light being the sun, and I think Shakespeare does something really, really clever there, actually. What he does is he demeans the intellect of Caliban. And actually, there's a joke, isn't there? To name the bigger light? Well, surely if he'd learnt properly, he would be able to say to name the sun. And I think Shakespeare is doing something incredibly clever there, which is that he's pressing the idea that Caliban actually isn't a very good subject after all. And that Prospero is king of nothing, because Caliban actually says it himself, for I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. He says, for I am all the subjects that you have. That is a horrendously useful quotation to know. And Caliban says this and actually points something out that perhaps Prospero doesn't recognise of himself. And what Prospero doesn't recognise of himself is he is only king of a useless island. And Caliban then, still in Act 1, Scene 2. Act 1, Scene 2 is an absolute gold mine for decent quotations. You taught me language, and my profit in't is I know how to curse. The Red Plague rid you for learning me your language. Now, the Red Plague is likely to be some sort of relevant contextual quotation for the 1600s. That it's likely that this referred to a disease that was fairly commonplace and dangerous. But you taught me language, and my profit on is I know how to curse. That's incredibly useful. Again, I've already sort of touched on the idea of intellectual colonialism, that Shakespeare presses us the idea that Prospero only controls Caliban because what he taught him does not enable Caliban to speak out against him with any power, and that Prospero sort of was incredibly kind to Caliban for so long. Now, obviously, Caliban, we know from what Prospero and Miranda say, states that Caliban tried to rape Miranda and is absolutely unrepentant of it. Another sort of little sly mention of the savagery of Caliban. This idea that even if you teach someone, you can't. Even if you teach someone savage, you can't make them less savage. There will still be this within them, which is actually an incredibly forward-thinking idea when we think 270 years later, in the next text on paper one, Robert Louis Stevenson comes up with the same idea in Jekyll and Hyde. And actually, this is all played upon by Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World, which is also solidly worth a read, actually, and obviously directly references a later part of The Tempest in its title, and actually it directly references it through the course of the text as well. A really nice little bit of science fiction, probably among the most important bits of science fiction to come out of the 20th century. Okay, and so from Caliban's savagery, we go to Miranda's, I hesitate to use the word stupidity, although, I mean, I think some people probably would. Naivety is much better, I think. Miranda has no idea of the outside world. She is forcibly kept uninformed about the real world. And that's critically important. And this is quite potentially Shakespeare making a comment on, or if not Shakespeare intentionally making a comment, at least grounds for us to make a comment on how women during the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods were kept suppressed by a lack of knowledge. This sort of idea that would run right up until, well, now, frankly, that if you don't teach someone something, then they can't use that thing against you. Miranda wasn't taught her history, so she couldn't use it against Prospero. And then what happens is people are fed things. So Miranda's statement on first seeing Ferdinand, this is the third man that AI saw, and first that AI sighed for. And with sighed, that sort of general connotation that she falls instantly in love with him. Now, obviously, the Shakespearean idea of sort of an instant love, Shakespearean idea of love at first sight, is really, really relevant. We see it in Romeo and Juliet, the sort of archetypal thing, which eventually leads to tragedy. I get really annoyed when people say, oh yeah, they're like Romeo and Juliet. I heard it at a wedding speech once. It was horrific. And you just think, what? They're like, one of them's 12, the other one's 18, and they're idiots that are going to commit suicide. This is not a romantic sentiment at all. I think I've said this before. I'd say the same thing over and over, don't I? It's just like one joke, something about mistletoe or something. Mistletoe as well, like incredibly romantic, but actually it's like a parasite that lives in other trees. So yeah, that's like less good. This is the third man that Aeneas saw and first that Aeneas sighed for. Heir to force the speech. It should be ever, obviously, but Shakespeare drops syllables in order to force the feeling of speech that happens. That's what I'm looking at. There. This sighed for, this sort of very naive, very youthful idea of what love looks like, codifies for us how naive Miranda is. This is the third man she's seen. The first was her father, the second was Caliban, who tried to rape her, the third is a prince. And we have this overriding idea of buying into a fairy tale. Now, fairy tales as we know them are only very much in their infancy in the 1600s, but they do exist. And we must remember that Miranda... So Shakespeare does something in his later plays that's quite common. He presents the idea that you can't quite escape your class despite the situation you're in. So... it's nice to look at this and The Winter's Tale together, even though obviously GCSE spec does not in any way demand it. And I imagine all of you are shivering slightly at the fact that I'm actually actively suggesting that you should study 2 Shakespeare plays off by heart as opposed to just 1. So in The Winter's Tale, we have a character called Perdita who doesn't know she's a princess, and she falls in love with a prince. And they seem to think they're some sort of star-crossed lovers, to quote Romeo and Juliet. And they fall in love, and everyone's like, oh my god, but she's poor, it's terrible. But she's secretly a princess, so their love is sort of vilified by the fact that she's secretly a princess. Now, Miranda, although she's grown up as like sort of a quasi-savage on an island, she's sort of dressed in the same silk she turned up in, which seems bizarre in a way. She still is what we refer to as courtly. She is still part of this like aristocratic elite. And one thing in Elizabethan society particularly, I know this is written in the Jacobean period, but Shakespeare lived most of his life under Elizabeth I, and therefore he works through those tropes quite a lot. One thing about Elizabethan society is Elizabethan society rigidly believed in class. You were born into a class and you stayed there. The idea of like class momentum or class movement does not exist. It's just not there. So despite the fact that Miranda and Prospero have lived on this island with absolutely no idea of the outside world, they've lived in rags, they live in a cave, all of these things, they are still part of the class they were born into, and that is hugely important. So that is Act 1 Scene 2 wrapped up. I know there's a huge amount in there. It's an absolute goldmine of quotations. You can do a lot worse than going back through Act 1, Scene 2 and just pulling out sort of 4 or 5 quotations, like little short things that you can absolutely learn. The next thing I'm going to look at is Act 2, Scene 2, and just a tiny bit of it. This is when Stefano and Trinculo first meet Caliban, or Caliban first meets Stefano and Trinculo, and it contains sort of... I'll just go to a later quotation first and then I'll go back to the first one I'll look at. So the later one is, I prithee be my God, from Caliban. So Caliban actually wanting to be subjugated. And we talked about this word loads and loads of times in lessons, this idea of subjugation, that characters are oppressed and repressed, actually. So they are stuck in a position, and Caliban is a natural servant. That is what he is meant to be. He is a subject, and that's critical to the play. Caliban is presented as being a subject. So how this sort of leads in is we also see Caliban's naivety as well. We see naivety in characters all the way through this play. It's sort of a play of wonderful naiveties in a way. That these are characters that just aren't aware of what's going on because they fail to realise the enormity of the situations they're in. Perhaps Shakespeare is making a comment here on the idea of the theatre as well, that the characters on stage have no idea of the world that watches them, but perhaps that's a little too conceptual in a way. Caliban asks Stefano, hast thou not dropped from heaven? And Stefano says, out of the moon I do assure thee, I was man in the moon when time was. And Caliban says, I have seen thee in her, and I do adore thee. My mistress showed me thee, and thy dog, and thy bush. Now, what we get here is sort of a stab at Caliban's lack of knowledge, but we also get a really subtle point. Caliban asks, hast thou not dropped from heaven? Now, heaven is a uniquely Christian idea, or at the very least a uniquely sort of monotheistic idea. So his asking that has he dropped from heaven indicates that he has learnt a Christian thought set. He has been taught to be a Christian. Now, that's actually quite interesting. Or I find it quite interesting. You might not care. Because although Caliban fails to recognise the fact that the moon is actually a ball of rock, what he can recognise is that there is a heaven and an earth, a firmament and a heavens. And so on some level he has been indoctrinated into a Western way of thinking at this point in time. So some of what Miranda and Prospero have taught him has clearly sort of sunk in, as it were. Some of it must have sunk into him. But then he breaks that idea by saying, I prithee be my God, only a few lines later, in that he doesn't understand that to be a god is to be a distant thing. He is naive enough to operate on a level of sort of a more primal religion set, which identifies that deities can exist in the real world. And that's quite interesting, because Caliban all at once operates on a lack of naivety and then enforces his naivety. So once again, this is really, really similar to his name the bigger light statement, in that he identifies the fact that he's been taught something, but he actually identifies the lack of ability to comprehend it. He cannot quite understand what he has been taught. That's really, really critical. So Act 3, Scene 1. Now, some of you will reckon, well, you should all. Actually, a couple of you won't. Those of you that answered on the wrong Shakespeare question, I still haven't quite forgiven you for that, but I'm sure I will over time. Act 3, Scene 1 should be quite recognisable to you, because it is the first. It is the relationship between Miranda and Ferdinand. Now, this keys into a really critical idea of courtly love. So, what is courtly love? Courtly love is the expected way of falling in love for the upper classes. Now, please make sure you understand. This is only really for upper classes in this point in time. And in fact, in other plays, Shakespeare recognises that in the lower classes, the idea of love is much more honest, and it's much less manipulated by the idea of class and arrangement and things that are sort of beneficial to society. So we must remember, at the start of this play, Antonio is on his way to marry off his daughter. And that's what he's doing, and that's why his ship comes close to Bermuda. Now, if you actually map things out, he's going the wrong way, and he's gone really the wrong way. He effectively has turned right instead of left at the the southern tip of Spain, which would be a mistake. But what we're seeing is a sort of microcosmic storyline that operates within a macrocosm of people who are trying to marry their daughters off. So marrying your daughter off was a way to sort of, in a lot of cases, prevent wars breaking out. Because the idea was that if your daughter was married off to another royal family, that royal family probably wasn't going to invade you. Now, there were some notable examples when this went critically wrong, but actually, it sort of worked quite a lot of times. And when we think about Princess Elizabeth, James I's daughter, married off to the heir to the throne of Bohemia, this was a way of entrenching that that bond between two nation states, empire states, and the idea was that by the intermarriage of European thrones, you could guarantee safety and security across mainland Europe. So contextually, Miranda's being married off to Ferdinand is actually very reminiscent of what's going on in the real world at this time. Now, obviously, what we actually have within the context of the play is we have what are Italian, what we now know as Italy, Italian city-states trying to marry each other or trying to gain advantageous allegiances with other countries in order to foster things like trade agreements, which is all incredibly dull in a way, in that it's all about almost marginal gains of power across Europe and Northern Africa. But on the other hand, what we have to understand is that what Shakespeare is writing about isn't just a love story. Firstly, it's a comment on courtly love, and secondly, it's a comment on the political climate of this time. These late plays of Shakespeare almost starts getting almost a little bit too big for his boots. He starts thinking, well, I'm really, really secure now. No one's really killed me or tried to kill me for a while. So I'm just going to make political comments, and it's going to be fine. Yeah, I'm going to get away with it. So Ferdinand starts carrying logs around. That's essentially what he's doing, isn't it? He's just carrying logs around. And he says, there be some sports are painful, and their labour delight in them sets off. Some kinds of baseness are nobly undergone, and most poor matters point to rich ends. This my mean task would be as heavy to me as odious, but the mistress which I serve quickens what's dead, and makes my labours pleasures. So so Ferdinand's saying, these things are heavy, and but it's fine because you're here, and so they're just a little bit lovely instead. So one part of courtly love is about achieving romance by, as a man, demonstrating that you are in some way strong and healthy and virulent, and that you can do difficult things because difficult things make love deserving. And that is pretty... what it does is it sort of defies a common logic, which is the common logic is that men could just sort of own any woman. But it was really about families sort of choosing the most suitable man to marry their daughter. And so often daughters were almost auctioned off to the highest bidder, and to the most powerful bidder, and to the bidder that did the most impressive things. So Ferdinand is fitting into a stereotype of the 16th, 17th century man. He does difficult things because difficult things sort of impress, is the idea. And Miranda is impressed, actually. Despite the fact that she slightly breaks the idea, because she offers to help, and Ferdinand sort of just goes, no, you will not help me do these things. I am a strong, independent man, and I will do things. So Miranda sort of goes, sort of gives in, she acquiesces to this, and this is still in Act 3, Scene 1. She says, I am your wife if you will marry me. If not, I'll die your maid. To be your fellow, you may deny me, but I'll be your servant whether you will or no. Miranda gives in. And she gives in from the very moment she sees him, because he is the first young, attractive man she's ever seen. And she has been brought up with this father figure that is entrenched in her an idea of duty. And that's a critical word to use in answers about Tempest, particularly if they are about gender or about social status, is duty. That's D-U-T-Y, not like J or something. I'm aware that anyway. So the idea is that Miranda does her duty to her father, but also notice what she says. I am your wife if you will marry me. The choice is Ferdinand's, not her own. She recognises on some level that she is some sort of young, attractive prospect, and she just offers herself up. But then notice the next. If not, I'll die your maid. Now, maid keys into the idea of virginity, which also Ferdinand sort of fetishizes because he's meant to. Which raises the quite interesting question. If we think about this, if we just press this into a sort of what-if scenario, which isn't entirely relevant, it might be quite interesting to think about. Caliban tries to rape Miranda. Ferdinand tells Miranda that he'll only marry her if she's has her maidenhood intact, if she's still a virgin. So what happens if Caliban succeeds? Does that make a totally different play? Possibly, and raises questions that are incredibly relevant to a very modern idea of what makes a woman, and also a sort of very modern interpretation of on what level domestic violence is blamed and sexual violence is blamed, which is worth thinking about because it raises some questions that are deeply uncomfortable, which is good. We like uncomfortable questions. So, to be your fellow, you may deny me, but I'll be your servant whether you will or no. Miranda is an absolute sap. Okay, she loses any sort of idea of independence. She loses any sort of idea of almost self-respect. And Shakespeare is presenting us in a way what is perceived at the time the ideal courtly woman. She falls madly in love with him, and then she has utterly no spine, because that is what is fetishized at that point by Elizabethan and Jacobean cultures. That what happens is you offer yourself to the man, and if he says no, you are broken. You may deny me, but I'll be your servant whether you will or no. She is saying, if you deny me, I will remain your servant forever, even though I know that you don't want to marry me. This is cripplingly sad. Shakespeare is presenting us what should be a typical Elizabethan woman, but it is fiercely juxtaposed, it's strongly juxtaposed against the idea of Elizabeth I on the throne. Elizabeth I on the throne, powerful woman. Strong, powerful woman. We know she had a number of reputed lovers, but most of the ideas of what actually happened are reasonably suppressed. But she was a strong woman, and possibly this is an intentional juxtaposition that Miranda represents something that is so out of line with what's on the throne only sort of 10 years before this, that she is meant to appear slightly ridiculous to the audience. We sadly, possibly positively, can't stand in the Globe in 1610, 11, 12. We can't stand there. We don't know how the audience would have reacted to this, but I think Miranda would have been seen as not a terribly positive character. So jump forward to 3-2 now. Caliban delivers what is likely... There are two really famous speeches in this play. This and also the Brave New World speech, which Miranda delivers right at the end. So Caliban's sort of most famous speech: "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again, and then in dreaming the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked I cried to dream again." Now, that's quite a long speech, and actually that's far too long for me to suggest you learn off by heart. I think that's just asking far too much, frankly. So, to answer a question that I've been asked quite a few times, and sort of a number of other English teachers and I have been sat there sort of trying to get a proper answer to, in a way, and sort of looking at mark schemes and grade boundaries, and looking at what actually happens, what constitutes reference to the text, what this word means. Now, with a speech like this, if you say the "be not afeard" speech, that's enough. That's fine, as long as you know what it's about. And so what is it about? What it's about is that Caliban is living in a perpetual nightmare. He sort of... His living existence is a nightmare, but it's also beautiful. So he uses this like strange reverse logic here to actually try and make this work. What he's saying is that the island is so beautiful that if it was a dream, when he waked, he would cry to be back in that dream. Caliban loves his island. That's sort of hugely important. He absolutely adores it. And he tells Stefano and Trinculo, "Do not be afraid. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not." He's saying that the natural world is beautiful. And the way he says it is beautiful. But on a very fast reading of this, what it looks like is that he's saying that the island is torturing him. It's not. It's that he tortures himself in a way. But the really important thing is that this island is so beautiful that it looks like a dream. And Shakespeare, who's at that point living in a growing metropolis of London, this city that is just starting to really be a city. I mean, it's not going to be like a proper city with sort of factories and pollution and stuff like that, like real pollution, until sort of the 1800s, really. So you've still got like 190 years. You've still got this growing city. I mean, when Shakespeare puts the Globe on the South Bank in order to sort of get out of some bizarre legislation on theatres north of the river, the South Bank has very little there, whereas now obviously London extends sort of miles and miles south of the river, and actually they couldn't, when they rebuilt the Globe, they couldn't put it where the Globe originally was. The rebuilt Globe is actually sort of I believe it's about 600 yards to the left if your back's to the river of where it's meant to be. There's just something there now, so development is huge. So Shakespeare's living in a city and writing about the beauty of nature, and he does it through a savage. And I use this word savage. It sounds like a pejorative. It sounds really derogatory, but I'm sort of keying into this retrograde interpretation, this idea that particularly Aldous Huxley in Brave New World that I mentioned earlier talks about, is the idea that someone who hasn't learnt what society looks like doesn't bother looking at society. What they do is look at the beauty of what they know. And so Caliban shows us the beauty of what we know. Now, what's quite interesting, of course, is that when we think about this as a staged play, Shakespeare has very little staging. He is absolutely at the forefront of what we would refer to as special effects. It's just its special effects in the 1600s. I mean, it's actually his downfall in a way. Well, the downfall of his theatre, pun, because it burns down. Which is sad. And it burns down because they set off a cannon, and the cannon sets fire to the thatched roof. So he is at the forefront of special effects. It's just special effects is like a guy with a cymbal. Ching. And that's it, really. So what we have is a man on stage, this sort of character that we laugh at because he thinks someone's the man in the moon. I have seen you. Absolutely adore that bit of the play. You know, he allows a character on stage to describe to us in the audience how beautiful the world looks. And that, for us, is huge. Because we are being described nature in a play that is about politics and manipulation. Because it is. I mean, Prospero is just manipulating in order to sort of gain his power back. This is not a wonderful play about love. It's funny, but it's also quite dark. It's about a man that has, in a lot of ways, subjugated his daughter in order to stop her asking why he's not telling her things. He puts her to sleep to hide his own power. I think if you wanted to really push hard, perhaps that is a comment on a political structure at the time. But I don't know how relevant that is, really. Okay, so we come like nearly to the end of the play now. It's not a greatly long play, and there are like quite a few other bits in it in terms of sort of storylines that are really half-baked. They don't really exist in a way. So, Prospero in Act 4, Scene 1. Our revels and now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air, and, like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which inherit shall dissolve, and, like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such things as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. That's Act 4, Scene 1, and that is another really, really useful speech to know that you probably won't know. But important bits of it that could be learnt. We are such stuff that dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. That sentence, that's learnable, really learnable actually. Partly because it's so well written. But you can paraphrase a little bit as well. That's absolutely fine. So another thing you might be able to learn is the great globe itself shall dissolve. Okay, you missed that bit which says, yeah, all which it inherit. Well, that's fine. You should learn to put an ellipsis in it. The great globe itself shall dissolve. Now, why is that so important? That's so important because Shakespeare is making a huge pun. And it identifies him as being Prospero. Now, that's a really brave statement that is possibly erroneous, but you can make it. Prospero is a sort of facade, a front for Shakespeare on some levels. And this is the bit where he sort of, I don't know, stabs it in our throat. He's not terribly subtle about it. The great globe itself. Ah, joke, brilliant. We know this is performed at the Globe. We know the theatre's called the Globe, and he tells us that the Globe will dissolve. I think this is a really sort of introspective, quite sad speech. Shakespeare is identifying that his life will end, and all of his work will disappear. Now, he can't have known that we'll be sitting here 400 years in the future, and it'll still be here. And some idiot sat in Hampton will be sort of lecturing over the internet about it. He can't have known this. But we are. His idea was that it would all go. That he had actually provided very little to the world. Now remember, Shakespeare's plays don't go into print. They're not actually printed until after he died. The first folio comes out in, I believe, 1623, which is sort of years after he dies. All he has are what are effectively memories. Photographs floating on water. They'll disappear. They'll go. His entire career is based on the fact that someone went to see something and might remember it. That's it. These are DVDs you can only play once. And he's looking back over his life here and he's thinking, it's all gone. And it will all go. You must remember, this is his last play. He knows he's an old man now. In terms of the context of the time, he knows that his life will end. And in his eyes, people will probably stop performing his plays. He is, in a way, lucky. He is very lucky that his actors decide to keep performing it. That his company of actors decide to keep performing his plays. That people like Garrick, who's a Shakespearean director, who lives actually just down the road from here. Doesn't live, he's been dead for like 300 years. Lives down the road from here. He restores a lot of Shakespeare. He brings it back to life. But still, we have a lot of plays that aren't performed. So some of his plays have sort of died out. We also don't know elements of things he did. We still don't know that much about him. So in a way, Shakespeare's right. What we think of Shakespeare is really a facade of him. It's a version. It doesn't quite exist. And Shakespeare identifies his own death. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. The sleep, of course, being a euphemism for his death. The dreams, euphemisms for plays, perhaps. Metaphors for plays. Versions. Things will dissolve. So just two little quotations go on, and it's not really little, is it? It's like the end. It's the entire epilogue. But I talked about two really important speeches. The second one isn't really a speech, actually, not in terms of actually the one I've just read you. The last one is Miranda. Oh, wonder how many goodly creatures are there here, how beauteous mankind is. Oh, brave new world that has such people in. Now, this is Miranda upon seeing the rest of the characters in the play. Antonio, Gonzalo, all these. And she finally realises that the world is bigger than just her little island. And that's quite important. Because perhaps this is a sort of realisation of Shakespeare that the world is bigger than London. That actually it should be a realisation for the audience. That the world is bigger than England. That things are bigger than they look. And this really keys in contextually to the idea that the whole world is opening up. This is the age of exploration, and Shakespeare is sort of fascinated by it. There's also a little bit of a sadness here, perhaps, because Shakespeare leads an interesting life in terms of his own home life. He's born in Stratford, educated in Stratford, gets married to Anne Hathaway very young, possibly because she was pregnant. And then he pretty much escapes. I use the word escape because it really looks like he was trying to escape. He runs away to London, buys an apartment, and then spends a lot of time sort of dotting between the two. But we know from his sonnets that he had a number of other loves. Possibly unrequited, possibly platonic, but he was definitely in love with other people. His sonnets really show it. So this idea of his daughter, also Prospero's daughter, and we say that Prospero occasionally stands in for Shakespeare during the course of this play. This idea that sort of Prospero's daughter, Miranda, finally sees the real world. There may be something in there metaphorically about her seeing her father, perhaps, and her father's place in the world. Perhaps. This is a suggestion for interpretation here, and may well be useful to go beyond. The phrase, "O brave new world that has such people in't," is learnable and is very learnable, and demonstrates the naivety of the characters through the course of the play. One of the great things about that quotation is that you can dot it in on an answer about Miranda that's really based in the first half of the play. And that shows that you can appreciate that the whole play maps a change in Miranda. A change of education. She starts incredibly naively, and then she changes as time goes on. Yeah, it's really important that she finally has this almost shocking realization of the outside world. So, I don't want to dwell on Prospero's epilogue for that long. It's been done in lessons quite a lot. It's clearly critical to the play. Most critics suggest that Shakespeare is saying goodbye to the theatre during this bit. That what he's doing is using Prospero as a sort of stand-in for him to say goodbye to the theatre. And the really important bits are in the second half of this. Particularly, the first half does something that Shakespeare does on a regular basis through his plays, which he does sort of like a prospective narrative as opposed to his retrospective narratives that start all his romances. He does a like prospective narrative where he what he does is he sort of says, it's all done, it's going to be fine, and he does this sort of relatively commonly. Now he does so he uses a lot of sort of like vaguely comedic puns, so that he sort of his idea is that on sorry, just take a step back a little bit. Part of the suggestions about this play is, and Bikram, yes, I will share all the quotations with this, thanks for asking. If you have questions, by the way, just email them to me and I'll sort of, like, vaguely ignore them. No, I'll actually ask them. Yeah, so please just email stuff to me, this is quite important. So Shakespeare has this weird fascination with hands. It's not that weird, actually. He just quite likes hands and using them as metaphors. He does it in Romeo and Juliet with the temples of their hands and pilgrims' hands do touch speech when Romeo and Juliet first meet. And he talks about hands here quite a bit. He says, "Since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the perceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please." Some lovely enjambment in that as well. If you're looking at it in terms of a poetic nature, gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, and then the caesura on the comma, like the light caesura. This is the epilogue, by the way, if you've got your books in front of me. If you don't, then okay, if you didn't take books home over Easter, Jekyll and Hyde and the Tempest are just available on Wikipedia. Go on the Wikipedia page for them, scroll all the way down to the bottom on the far right. It's got original source text, just click on that, okay, and that will give you the whole of the text. I appreciate that some people may have forgotten to do this, or may now be thinking, well, actually I want to do a bit more work on this. History Boys isn't, I'm afraid, just because it's quite a modern text, so it's not out of copyright yet. The poetry is, you just have to be a little clever about it. So what you need to do is go on the AQA website for literature. It's 8702 is the code for it, and then if you go on the spec and get the PDF, then it has a list of the poems, and then you just need to go and find them, okay? But I'll talk about that. So I'll do poetry and history boys tomorrow. Okay. Today I'm going to take 5 in a second, and then go and do, and then we'll do Jekyll and Hyde when I come back. Okay. So on the face of this is a sort of strange little direct address to the audience. Okay. So this is a soliloquy, and it's a sort of dramatic monologue. It's directly addressed to the audience, and that use of second person in this Bear Island by your spell is really important, because right at the end of Shakespeare's career, he decides finally to talk to his audience through the character of Prospero. But what he's asking is for them to clap so that he can leave, because Shakespeare says, well, Prospero says, gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Prospero says that all he wanted was to please the audience. Or Prospero saying that all he wanted was happiness for people. And has he actually achieved that? Miranda is now married off to someone she didn't even know 6 hours ago. Gonzalo's sort of project is stumped. Stefano and Trinculo are like sad now. Caliban's never really addressed quite whether he's forced to stay there or not. Either way, it's not great for him, and to be perfectly honest, he's either like destined to die a lonely life on an island, or he's being taken to Milan to be what is effectively a sideshow exhibit, which is mentioned by Stefano and Trinculo. A man will pay a florin to see a dead Indian. I think the quotation is, just trying to lift it off the top of my head. And actually, people of other races were regularly exhibited in the precursor to freak shows in Elizabethan England. This was a common thing, and Shakespeare makes a really strong point about that, actually, that people are more than willing to see the dead body of someone from another country as opposed to help their fellow man. And Shakespeare's like attitude towards that is really forward thinking, actually, at the time, which is quite impressive considering he's also putting it on stage, which sort of leads him into danger in terms of people that don't like that. You've got to remember, the playwright's job is based on whether they are entertaining in the end. So Shakespeare sort of delivers this idea that you have to clap and shout, otherwise his job's not really worked. And then he does it again, but in a slightly less obvious way, perhaps. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer. Now, on the face of it, this is a really religious statement, saying that he knows that his sort of career hasn't been the most devout, hasn't been the most religious in the world. In fact, this is also seen as being an apology to James I. James I really hated witchcraft. He really hated witchcraft. He burnt a lot of people. He really hated witchcraft. He wrote books about witchcraft and how much he hated it. And he particularly hated any idea of magic. So Shakespeare in his last play talks about magic. And this is like, I often feel like in his last couple of plays, Shakespeare goes back to being a teenager. And he's finally let off the leash. He knows he's probably going to die in the next few years. He's old. He's done. But God, is he going to annoy some people on his way out? And he's going to make some really big statements as well. So this relieved by prayer. So on one hand, it's your hands together to pray, and on the other hand, it's like clapping again. Which pierces so it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults, as you from crimes would pardon be. Let your indulgence set me free. And it's that statement, indulgence. This is also, well, possibly a joke on Catholicism. So Catholicism allowed indulgences, which was, you could pay the church to let you off your sins. So there's these sort of like words dropped into there in order to sort of just slightly turn the knife at the people watching it. And it's that, and freeze all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. to be pardoned, you need to pay an indulgence, and your indulgence in my play pardons me from its faults. And that's Shakespeare really like shoving it down the throat of his audience, that he is going to go out on that level of political statement. But he does it in the frame of a joke. Shakespeare goes out with a joke. And it's this joke on clapping and praying and a sort of half-baked apology to James I, who of course wasn't Catholic anyway. So it's sort of this like rotisserie of various interpretations of jokes. And at the same time him once again noticing that his career is over. He says, and my ending is despair unless I be relieved by prayer. He identifies that actually, if you don't clap this one, there hasn't been really that much point in him being there at all. But it is slightly more upbeat than his earlier speech. He is, we are the things that dreams are made on. That is sort of critically important. Okay, I'm going to take 5 minutes to go and drink a lot of coffee, probably. So I will be back on with Jekyll and Hyde at 2. Let's call it 2:20 by my clock. It's 2:13 at the moment on mine. And then I will be back on with Jekyll and Hyde. Alright, thank you very much, guys. This is a bit where I don't